my name's Jeanette Sutherland. I'm an SAC advisor based on the Isle of Skye. I've got a croft myself, and we've always had hens on a family croft. So I'm coming from it from a very practical point of view, but I'm very delighted that I've got my colleague Caroline, who's an SRUC vet, with us. Caroline, can I pass over to you to do a proper introduction of yourself?
Hi there, I'm Caroline Robinson. I'm one of the vets for SRUC Vet Services. I'm currently based in Perth. We do a lot with all sizes of poultry keepers, so we'll go right from pet poultry keepers all the way through to large commercial units where no job too big or small there. We also run training sessions for vets about poultry, and we do a little bit of work occasionally in conjunction with our lovely colleagues at APHA, who if you're not already aware of APHA, we'll let you know a wee bit more about them. We're also involved in some of the sampling of wild birds for the bird flu too. So we're quite involved in various different areas, and yeah, we're always really happy to get out there and help people hopefully prevent problems before they even arise.
Fantastic. So just because a few more of you come in, so just as a reminder that this webinar is funded by the Farm Advisory Service. So if you could please, tomorrow you'll probably get an email with an evaluation form. If you could please remember to return that. And it, like I said before, we'll make our emails available. So if there's any follow-up questions after the webinar is finished, do let us know. We're going to have a Q&A panel at the end, so you can ask any questions. But if you've got questions as you're going along, if you stick them in the chat, then we'll make sure that nobody gets lost, and we can stop to answer them then. Caroline, do you mind sharing your starting your presentation, please?
There we go. So up front, just to clear the elephant in the room, the first thing that an awful lot of people who are just thinking about getting new poultry, or alternatively, if you are thinking about expanding your poultry, obviously the big thing over the last couple of years has been the risk of bird flu, what you might be asked to do, what you're going to have to think about doing right now, where the problems with that are. There are quite a few different resources that will keep you right at all times, because it can change the requirements and the situation, certainly. So we'll tell you where to find those resources, because of course I can tell you all of the resources, what all of the resources say about our situation just now, and then literally next week it could be a different situation. So we can tell you exactly where to keep up to date, so there's a bit less misinformation or a little bit less confusion. It's definitely something that is always a fast-moving situation at this time of year. These are example of a couple of the handy posters that are available on the Scottish Government website, just to have as aid memoirs, you know, just visual reminders that you can stick up on your shed wall or whatever, if you're trying to remember what it is that is the main checklist of things that you should be aware of during a bird flu outbreak. So what has happened over the last few years? Briefly, just to tell you, these are different migratory paths. So each colour is a different migratory path for wild birds. So some birds will go all the way around the world like that. Some will go from north to south a bit more. Along these pathways, they'll congregate at certain water holes, they'll congregate at certain sort of ideal spots where you can get absolutely vast numbers of birds together. And if one bird or a few birds in those areas is sick, then it can pass to other birds, and then they can all go off in different directions. You'll see that there's some intersections of these migratory pathways. So if, for example, a new disease arises in the middle of America, or if the new disease arises east of us, it can spread really, really quickly. It's almost like that classic situation in the pandemic type films, you know, that you get where a traveller gets on a plane, somebody's sick, they have a cough, they get on a plane, and instantly it's spread everywhere. And birds have that system too. So that's one of the reasons that we do end up with the possibility of new strains of bird flu coming in very, very quickly and spreading. It is a virus. Most strains of avian flu, avian influenza, only affect birds. It's a notifiable disease. If you've not been involved in keeping farm species before, you may not be aware of what a notifiable disease is. It means that if you suspect that you have that disease, or you have a situation where you're worried about that disease on your premises, you do have to report it to the government. You do have to report it through the APHA, the Animal and Plant Health Agency, which is your local animal health office. And it just means that those are diseases that just can't be allowed to run unchecked in the countryside. So if you haven't come across a notifiable disease before because you haven't been involved in keeping sheep or cattle or whatever other farmed species, then that's what it means. It's an offence not to report it if you're worried about it. You don't have to report it directly yourself. It's always a really good idea, if you're worried about anything with your poultry, to speak to a vet if you can. I know some of you will be in more remote areas where access to a vet can be very difficult. And if that's the case, then you can speak to the duty vet at the APHA. There is a central phone line, which is on the APHA website that you can phone. A lot of people get a wee bit worried, thinking that, you know, agency vets are going to be scary, or, you know, that something dreadful is going to happen even if they don't have bird flu or something like that. I work regularly with them, and honestly, they're down to earth, they're friendly, they're really helpful, they're really practical. A lot of their conversations will literally be, no, I don't think you've got anything to worry about. And that's fine. You're not bothering anybody. You know, you're not wasting anybody's time if you just want to ask a few questions. And it's the same with your practice vet as well. They would always just want to know if there is something that's really worrying you, and it might not necessarily merit a visit. You know, it's just worth having the conversation. So it can be carried by wild birds, and it can be carried into your buildings on objects as well. So if your quad bike or if your welly boots go through some bird poop that's infected, you can track it into your poultry buildings. It can affect small or large flocks. It does not matter if you've got 2 chickens. The effect of bird flu in 2 chickens, in terms of, you know, it's going to need investigated, and it will have some effects on transport in your local area and things. It's the same situation as if you had 3,000. The strains that you see bandied about in the newspaper, H5N8 or H5N1, they're named for the different types of spike proteins that you'll see on the surface of viruses. It just basically means that there's different strains of the virus that are characterized by the proteins that are on their surfaces. Some of those are not particularly lethal, some of them are not particularly serious, and some of them are. The different strains of flu have different behaviour. So not all flus are going to be a total catastrophe, and some strains really are a total catastrophe. So if you've got chickens, or if you've recently had chickens, or indeed if you've had chickens for many years but you just haven't really gone through that much in the way of bird flu epidemics before, because in this country we really didn't have a problem until very recently, you might be worried about how you could spot it. There's 2 types. They're called high pathogenic and low pathogenic. High pathogenic just means really severe, and low pathogenic means less severe, but they're all still reportable. So again, that's some more jargon you might see bandied about that you maybe didn't know until now what they meant. The high path is more serious, it's often fatal, it's often really dramatically fatal. You're not usually talking about one wee chicken, you're quite often talking about a lot of your birds affected all at once, or very soon after each other. They might have a swollen head, they might go purple because they're not getting enough oxygen. They stop eating, they might be coughing and wheezing, you might see some diarrhea, you might see a big reduction in the number of eggs that you've gotten all of a sudden, and you probably would see deaths. You would probably see quite a few deaths very quickly. The reason that you might see different posters for ducks and geese keepers, and this is certainly one of the ones that is useful for you guys that are asking about ducks, is that while it's always obvious in chickens, sometimes ducks and geese don't show as many signs, or don't show it as severely, or don't show it as early. So when the government sometimes has to put a housing order or they have to put a prevention order in place for bird flu, which applies to all of poultry keepers. So the last couple of winters, last 2 or 3 winters, we've seen legal intervention where prevention orders or when housing orders have been put in place. They will often tell you to keep ducks and geese, basically waterfowl, separate from chickens, because you might not necessarily see symptoms in ducks and geese the same way that you would with chickens. Low pathogenic flu usually shows less serious signs. You might see mild breathing problems or a bit of reduction in eggs or a little bit of diarrhea. It's not as serious to the chickens, but it is still something that the government are interested in. So it's spread bird to bird, spread also in body fluid, and it's spread in poop. It's not airborne over large distances. So if you have, for example, somebody 10 miles down the road that has bird flu, you're not usually expecting that to be able to get into the wind or the air and be carried towards you. They are looking more at shifting of birds over large distances. It can be moved in contaminated clothing or equipment or anything like that, though. So you might see some restrictions in place regarding visitors, especially visitors that have their own poultry as well. So what are the requirements if you do get chickens or indeed any poultry? What are you going to be required to do if we start having a bit of a bird flu outbreak again each year? The requirements can vary. So last year was a little bit less serious and we didn't see a big housing order put in place in Scotland. It can vary between countries in Great Britain and Northern Ireland as well. You could find that there's maybe a housing order in place in England, but not in Scotland, or vice versa, depending on the situation. So it could be just that you're asked to use enhanced biosecurity requirements, which will be detailed on the government website, such as using a specific disinfectant, trying to keep separation between your poultry and wild birds, or in severe cases, it could extend all the way to housing order, which is usually characterised by immediate and compulsory housing for chickens, turkeys and ducks, at the very least. The problem that you've got if you are just thinking about getting chickens, regardless of whether you've got 2 or 3 as pets, all the way through to I would like to buy 200 and start doing farm gate eggs, is nowadays it's a really good idea to think about, if I am asked to house all of these and they're currently free range, could I do that? Because we did see a lot of stress to people trying to find shelters, repurpose buildings that were already full of farm equipment or garden lawnmowers or whatever, or buying tarpaulins and making shelters. It was quite a big ask, really. But nowadays we know that we're more likely to have outbreaks of bird flu. You are going to have to think, if I'm asked to house these like tomorrow, could I do it and how would I do it in a way that's not going to stress them out? If it's completely impractical to house them, there is a slight provision under, or has been a slight provision under the housing order in certain situations, just to completely separate them from contact with wild birds rather than house them, because some people have had fairly unhousable pet or farm birds. Like somebody once asked me about ostriches, which it does. The problem, the poultry registration does apply to things like ostriches, but it can be quite difficult to build a run sufficient to keep them covered at all times. So they may also ask you to keep species separate, chickens and turkeys versus geese and ducks.
Now, Caroline, we've been asked on the chat for a wee clarification. So what is expected with a housing order? Can they stay in the run or do they need to be kept in the hen house?
What the housing order usually means is that you're going to have a covered area that they're in with complete separation from wild birds and wild bird poo. So yes, runs are fine as long as you can cover them. So for example, I've got a wee picture in here where you wouldn't be expected to keep them all in the house because it's a wee dark house and it's not at all sufficient. They would definitely be allowed into that run, because it's covered and birds can't poop on it. But unfortunately, they have put their house right under some trees that wild birds are going to sit in and poop. So this is, partly a good thing because they've got a covered run, but at the same time, they have made a mistake because they've gone and put it in an area that could be fully expected to have quite a lot of wild birds in it. So you've got to keep their food separate from wild birds and free from contamination from bird poop. You've got to keep their water separate and again, free from contamination. And you've got to keep the birds themselves away from the wild birds and bird poo. So yeah, by all means, you are definitely going to need a run. Because it's very, very rare unless you've got a full massive barn with natural light and it's usually kind of purpose built for poultry. If you are just the sorts of person who have a shed or a coop where the birds go to sleep at night and to lay their eggs and things, you are going to need a run, but you are going to want some way of covering it. And the cover might be as simple as tarpaulins. You're not looking to stop anything from breaking in. That's not going to happen, and that's not going to be what they're worried about. They're just worried about wild birds pooping it into the place that your chickens are scratching about and eating. So that's the definition of separation, really. And you just want really good biosecurity always. You don't want rodents getting into your stored feed, rats and things like that, and crows and so on. If you've got your feed stored separately in sacks, then you might want to invest in decent metal bins, just to keep the vermin away from your feed. So, but yeah, we find that wild birds are really, as you would expect, really attracted to food and water. Chicken feed isn't great for wild birds. It's actually too high in calcium. So in terms of health-wise, it's not great if they're always getting into your runs and stuff in their faces anyway. But yeah, these days it's also quite a big thing from a bird flu perspective.
So
Caroline,
Caroline, just a small interruption. So just to clarify, we're covering bird flu because with it being such an issue, it's very important when people are starting with poultry that it's in from the plans from the very start. So we will be
absolutely
we'll be covering lots of other topics that we need to think about as for starting with poultry shortly. But there's just another question on the order. So the question was that they understood keeping the species separate for housing, but if they have ducks and chickens and they're all free range throughout the day, is this an issue? And I suppose this is probably under two questions, maybe to clarify, maybe under the circumstances now, and if there was another housing order put on, Caroline.
Yeah, so I mean, if you are in a bird flu affected area, or if you are in a housing order, then you will find that there's a requirement. It will be specified in the housing order that you should be keeping them separate. In terms of day to day, is it the world's best idea to have chickens and ducks scratching around together when there's a year-round slight risk of bird flu? It's maybe not like 100% in an ideal world, but ultimately that's what they're going to do. If you have free-range birds, I think the thing is about all of our talks really is we'll always tell you both the ideal world situation and we'll also point out to you that there are going to be things that suit your management. There are going to be things that suit the way that you would like things to be that maybe aren't 100% the most ideal thing in the whole world, but ultimately, there are real world situations. Keeping chickens and ducks free ranging together, if I was going to pick out the most concerning thing about that, it's that a lot of the ducks that we see through our post-mortem rooms, and we don't see that many because not that many people keep them, but when we do see them in for diagnostics, it's quite often nutritional, especially with the younger ones. So if you've got your chickens and your ducks going around together and they're maybe getting fed together and things like that, ducks do have slightly different requirements. So I would say, if it was the middle of summer and they're going around together, I maybe wouldn't be that worried about bird flu. But I would start to question, okay, well, what are they getting fed? How are they getting fed it? Is there a possibility that your ducks are all going to start going down with problems that your chickens don't have because of the nutrition? So yeah, it's worth keeping that in mind. So there may be a requirement to keep them separate in a housing officer, in a housing order, but you know, at other times of year there are slightly different considerations that might make it a wee bit less than ideal as well. So you just sometimes have to find ways around that. So there's a few details handouts. Don't worry yourself about trying to copy down those links or anything like that. I wouldn't worry about it, because we can send you out a wee pack. If you would rather than looking for the info on the government website, if you'd rather that we sent you the links, and I'll show you a few other things that are useful sources of information. If you'd rather we sent you copies of those as well, that's fine. We can definitely do that. So just to finish up on the bird flu, what does it mean for you? Whether you are expanding, whether you are just about to get any kind of poultry, you're going to need to consider how you might house them if you're asked to do so. You're going to have to consider how to do that with a minimum of stress, which means a sufficient amount of space always, because poultry are tricky that way. Are you going to use something you've already got? It's only just keeping them away from the bird poo. So some people have been using polytunnels. If you've got one that you don't use anymore, you're also going to want to have a wee think about, even if there's not a housing order, in a prevention zone or a prevention order, you are required to use a decent disinfectant that is DEFRA approved for bird flu. So you're going to want a decent source of that. So your local agricultural store, if you have one, or ordering in some disinfectant if you don't, because disinfecting your boots and equipment, and any you know, if you did have visitors coming round, disinfecting their feet and things like that, are something that you might want to consider, or maybe required to consider, if we do go back into having bigger problems this year. And it's pretty unpredictable. Some years it's not that bad, some years it's really quite bad. So it can be quite unpredictable.
I think a practical thing to think of as well is, if you're used to having your birds free ranging and then you do have to house them, is to make sure that you've got a good source of water, because when they're not getting water from their streams and stuff outside, it's really quite surprising how much they need.
Yeah, and it's quite surprising as well how some of your chickens can just turn into little demons, because they've certain breeds, or sometimes certain individuals, really thrive on being allowed to free range and get very, very aggressive or depressed or something if they're not allowed to free range anymore. And there are certain, you know, there are certain strains that are kind of bred to be really hardy and vigorous, and there are some that are bred to try and be a bit more docile. So these are things that you can think about, you know, if you don't have that much space to house them, but it is obviously sufficient space to house them, are you maybe thinking about getting slightly more docile chickens just in case? Or are you wanting really sort of hardy things that love to leg it about a massive paddock? These are things to think about. So that's just a wee summary there. And your updates, you can get them from your vet, from us, from APHA, from the guys over at Farm Advisory Service and SAC Consulting, from the Scottish Government website, which is the most important source of information that you can look at yourself. And you can register your poultry, which we can talk about. You must register your poultry if you've got 50 or more birds. For those of you thinking about waterfowl, it doesn't mean 50 chickens and 50 ducks. It's 50 birds altogether. So you must register if you go over the 50 within a month of arrival. If you've got fewer than 50, you do not need to register them, but you can voluntarily register them. And that would allow DEFRA to see, well, APHA and DEFRA to see you on their map if there was an outbreak local to you that might affect you, so that they can let you know quickly. So there's a bit less confusion. There's chickens, turkeys, ducks, geese, game birds, pigeons if they're reared for meat, ostriches, emus, rheas and cassowaries. We have had some of the larger birds questioned about in previous webinars. So it's on the government website, gov.uk, and it's on the poultry registration page if you're looking for it. So on to your chickens now. There's different types that you can get. If you've never had a look at this before, you could go for pure breed chickens, of which there are a couple of hundred. We won't be going through them all. They all have different temperaments, sizes, and sometimes colours of eggs. You can get dual purpose birds, which can lay eggs and also have sufficient meat on them to be meat birds, which sometimes solves people's problems if they're wondering what to do with male chickens that have hatched. Some of them are really just for show. They are less likely to be vaccinated before you get them. So that's important to know, just because they're reared in small batches a lot of the time, and vaccines come in very, very, very large batches for chickens a lot of the time. They tend to lay fewer eggs if you're just looking week to week. However, they will sometimes continue to lay eggs, perhaps a little bit older than some of the other type, the hybrid layers. And you'll get less extreme body types in the meat breeds than you would expect to see on your shelf in Tesco. Those massive breasted chicken carcasses in Tesco are very, very different types of birds than what you would be buying if you were buying pure breed birds, which had traditionally been used for meat. So you won't get quite as much meat on them, but arguably slower growing, slightly more traditional production. For some people, that is sort of more an acceptable way that they would feel to produce meat. You can get fancy breeds and bantams as well, and just be aware there are disease predispositions in some breeds. So those little guys, those little silkies there, they're beautiful. They do look like little muppets. They're very popular with kids. They can sometimes be particularly susceptible to Marek's disease. We'll talk about diseases in a bit more depth next week. So if anybody has any specific questions to go in depth about particular diseases, that's probably more next week's discussion. But yeah, we'll definitely be covering that. Your hybrid layers are bred to be really prolific layers early in life. They can come in all different colours, but they're all usually a fairly similar size and shape, your kind of classic chicken. I would check the hardiness. There's a lot of people out there these days that are selling all sorts of coloured hybrid layers, which are easy to tell apart because of being different colours. They're very attractive. They're great if you've got a croft or a small farm that you're using to diversify into tourism. You're maybe having visitors for a B&B. You're maybe having folk onto a cottage on the land. So these lovely, attractive, different coloured chickens are sometimes quite a draw to families from towns. I would check how hardy some of these are, because honestly, I've tried a lot of them out myself, and some of them are brilliant, and some of them have been rubbish in Scottish weather. So, it's worthwhile just checking out what it is you're buying. They can come from large or small suppliers. There are some people that are producing them in very large numbers up here. There are some local sellers that will buy in a few hundred chickens at a time and just sell them off in 5s to 10s to 20s to local premises. So they can come from very different situations. Large suppliers might have given them a full vaccination protocol, the same as you would for a commercial chicken. Some of the smaller suppliers may or may not have vaccination and treatment protocols, so that's always worth asking about. Those guys will lay lots and lots of eggs for the first 2 years, and then their production will drop off. That is how they were bred. It's how they were developed. Unlike a chicken that hasn't been selectively bred, who would maybe lay fewer eggs but for longer of their life, hybrid layers will really go for it for the first couple of years. And this sort of applies to either just your standard brown chickens that would literally be used to produce eggs for supermarkets, right the way through to things like these black rocks in my back garden, who, they are hybrid layers. They're kind of in between in that they were bred to be a bit hardier for the outdoors, but they're still very good prolific layers as well. So yeah, and you'll see the rise in coloured eggs as well has pushed a bit of a rise in certain breeds. Some of them that produce coloured eggs are still decently hardy, which surprised me at times, because I originally just assumed that different coloured eggs might predispose all of those chickens to be a bit, less bred for practical purposes. But some of the coloured egg layers are actually pretty good, even in a Scottish climate, and some of them are less so. That's an example of the sort of vaccination protocol a large supplier would be giving to chickens. So you can see that from day one right the way through to just before they're getting sold at point of lay, 16, 17, 18 weeks later, they do sometimes end up with an absolute ton of different treatments and vaccines. So that's the sort of thing that definitely any commercial sizable egg producer would be getting chickens from suppliers that would be doing that. Some of your smaller scale backyard suppliers will be doing that, and some of them won't. The trouble comes when you're mixing vaccinated chickens and unvaccinated chickens. If you buy from a couple of different suppliers and you don't realize you've just done that, then the chickens that are vaccinated could be carrying something without any symptoms that they're just going to give to your ones that are unvaccinated. A lot of people will look at ex-commercial rescue hens. They can be quite prolific layers for a year or so. It is a big adjustment for them to a different environment, a different diet. They're in different groups. They've maybe really not been terribly much outdoors. It's a sudden exposure to challenges, and do just be aware that while some of them can recover and do pretty well, you can also see some of them just really not cope very well. They quite often do come a little bit baldier than you would be expecting. So do be aware of that as well. And some people obviously have, you'll maybe have seen on social media, some people knit them with jumpers just to get them over the first couple of months while they're refeathering themselves.
Caroline, just to interrupt you for a second, we've got a wee question for a bit of clarification on some terms. So what is a hybrid layer? Do you mean a bird that is also suitable for meat?
No, a hybrid layer just means it's not a purebred chicken. So we've got our two types, which are the purebreds, which you'll see. Hybrid layers aren't actually pure breeds. They have been developed by companies mixing together different chicken lines to produce just the most productive chicken. So things like your Isa Brown, things like your Black Rock, even though they have names, they're kind of they've been a hybrid of various different traditional breeds, then selectively bred to be really super egg layers. So yeah, your pure breeds will tend to be things that haven't really been meddled with too much with regards to trying to make them lay an egg every single day for a very long time. Whereas your hybrid layers really have been developed to just go as much as possible for the next couple of years, and then drop off sharply. So yeah, you'll get a lot of different chickens, which do appear to have names, but they're sometimes just the names of commercially developed crossbreeds, essentially. So if you do see a particular type of chicken that you like, it's a great idea to look it up online, because even though there's a few hundred different names that you might see, you will definitely find on places like the Poultry Keeper website or other websites, they'll tell you a little bit more about what type of chicken that is, maybe how many eggs per year you could expect to get from them, what type of egg you could expect it to be, how long they're expected to live, that kind of thing. It's definitely worth doing a little bit more research.
Great. And we just got another question before you move on. And this is certainly a question for a vet. If you're not sure about the vaccination status, should we get them done, even if that means they've been done twice?
You probably won't get them done. So two reasons. First of all, some of the vaccinations have to be done when they're chicks, otherwise they're completely useless. Secondly, when you buy a batch of vaccines, you're quite often looking at buying about 500 doses at a time. Just because, unfortunately, if you're on a small scale with poultry in this country, and indeed any country, all of the vaccines, a lot of the hybrid layer strains, it's all geared towards somebody with 10,000 chickens in a shed or 5,000 chickens in a shed who's going to keep them for a year and then is going to get rid of them. So the vaccines sometimes only last for around about a year or two as well. And again, they aren't necessarily something that is going to protect them if you repeat them, because you might not know when to repeat them at the right time, because nobody's ever tested when they wear off. Some of them might last lifelong, some of them might last a few years, some of them might only last a year. So if you've come across some people that you know, for example, who know that they've bought vaccinated chickens and then are really quite shocked and upset when about 3 or 4 years old, some of their chickens have ended up getting Marek's disease. The vaccine was never designed to last for that long. So yeah, I'm afraid I would always, if you've had an outbreak of disease, I would always get your vet to have a wee chat about it, because in some situations with some diseases, it might be advisable to intervene with some vaccines, because there are some vaccines that might be able to reduce future disease, even if they're given in adult chickens. But it's very it's very specific to different situations. So yeah, overall, you're definitely not looking at trying to vaccinate everything with about 6 different diseases after a year of having them, because that just isn't, unfortunately, the way that vaccines work out with chickens. So hopefully that helps information wise.
Great.
If you're looking production wise and you're not hatching your own, we can go through hatching and things probably next week, because we don't really have too much time this week. But point of lay pullets usually come around about 17, 18, 19 weeks of age. So if you're buying laying hens and they're down as point of lay pullets, that's roughly how old they are. They'll usually start laying if they're hybrid layers. Now, the problem with all of the stats is that they apply to the bog standard crossbreed chicken that produces lots of eggs. That for hybrid layers, they'll normally start laying at around about 20 to 22 weeks of age. If you've got a pure breed, that's going to vary with breed. Some of them don't lay quite as early. Usually they'll lay for around about 9 to 12 months. That could be up to 270 eggs. Again, some of the poultry websites like Poultry Keeper and so on will tell you breed to breed how much you could expect. Hybrids tend to be at the higher end, and then you would expect them to molt. And when they're molting and they're replacing their feathers, you would expect them to have maybe no eggs, or maybe they're producing fewer eggs, because they're using all of their protein in their diet to make new feathers rather than daily eggs. And then when they do go into a second laying cycle with some of the prolific breeds, prolific crossbreeds, you can expect to see a bit fewer eggs even in their second year, which is why you see such young chickens getting turfed out as rescue hens, as your ex-commercial hens. It's because they really only keep them for a year and a half or so. They tend to be a little bit less productive. So you're setting up, picking your spot. Your area is definitely going to have some quirks. Hens don't like wet. They don't really enjoy massive drafts. You also want them to have some shade if it's going to be particularly sunny. And you're going to know from your own experience which direction all of that is coming from, whether or not there's any shade. Is it flood prone? Do you get a massive drought? Are you going to have to think about your water supply? How high up are you? Do you get lots of snow during the winter? They don't like that either. All of these things are worth thinking about. You want to go out and stand in your area and kind of think to yourself, right, okay, do I have everything that I would need to keep me warm and safe and shaded and happy if it was raining, or if it was windy, or if we had whatever. Your soil type might potentially be a consideration, because they do peck down all the vegetation and turn it into mud. If you have ducks, this is going to be even more of a consideration, because ducks are going to mess up your land even more than chickens. They do plouter about quite a bit, do ducks. So if you have sandy soil versus heavy soil, that would make quite a difference in terms of how much space you need to give them and so on, because although there's always going to be online various recommendations about how much is the minimum amount of space you need to give per bird, you do need to adjust that. That is always the minimum amount of space you need to give per bird. If you've got really heavy, damp soil, then you're probably going to have to increase that quite a bit. And do you have any existing infrastructure that you can use to make things a little bit cheaper and to work for you? So here's an example. That's out my front window. you would look at that and think, right, I could fence off a little bit right at the bottom of that field and it would be beautiful. I could just make a hen run right there, run a bit of fencing along for a wee mini chicken paddock. It'll all be good. And that's it a few months later. So if you were thinking bottom left corner would be really handy outside the house where you could keep an eye on them and so on, it's just got a river running through it basically, which isn't there except for a few weeks of every year, but it would be a problem when it was. If you're thinking about housing, there are many different types on the market. If you're thinking about upgrading your existing housing, again, you're going to want to have a little think about whether or not to do something a bit different. Think about what went well, think about what you hated about your previous housing. They always list the minimum number of hens that and the maximum number of hens that they think can fit in a particular shed, barn, tiny coop, whatever. They do include bantams in this. So if something says this takes 20 to 30 hens, the 30 is probably going to be bantams. They don't actually specify. They're not always talking about a specific type of chicken like a hybrid layer. If you've got something big, like a pure breed called a buff Orpington, which is a big floofy thing, then you're going to want to give them more space than your traditional chickens. If you've got bantams, then they sometimes need a bit less space. It's absolutely fine. Whether or not you're going to have them roofed with felt or whether you're going to have them roofed with something else. So that's got felt. If you got really bad red mite in this housing, red mite love to live in crevices that you can't treat and you can't clean. So underneath the roof felt, between the wooden slats of the roof and the roof felt, is a great place to hide. It makes life very difficult if you're trying to get rid of red mite. That's a parasite of poultry. It's very important. We will talk about that next week. This sort of thing is a little different. There's no wooden roof under that. That's called onduline. And it's quite handy because it means that you can clean either side of it. Some people will look at movable housing to make sure that the paddock always stays nice and green with lots of lovely grass to scratch about in and eat. And if you're on the smaller end, then you could get something ultra cleanable like a plastic house, which is super easy to disinfect. If you've got a family, you're having them as pets, you're super, super busy all the time, then perhaps something that's easily cleanable and disinfectable like that would be the thing for you. Here's some more examples. This whole run moves, which is fantastic. You can see it's covered, so that would be perfect. If you did end up in a housing order, you've already got yourself sorted with a cover. I'm not a huge fan of these little, you'll see them outside every feed store. You'll see them in pet shops. I'm not a huge fan of these. If you're not out there sharpest first thing in the morning to let those birds out, that window lets the light right in and there's not that much space inside the house. They can get quite aggressive with each other. So although they're cheap and they're really widely available, they don't last a huge amount of time. They are softwood. Yeah, I think for small spaces, a lot of people are attracted to them because they've got the integrated run as well. It comes with problems. You can build your own. Here's somebody constructing their own chicken tractor bit by bit inside a shed. Plywood and corrugated leftover seating. If you've already got a croft or something, you could actually find some really decent plans online and ask about other farmers. If you're good with welding and construction, then you're really sorted there. You want to make sure that runs give them enough space and movement. If you are putting them in the barn all year round, then that's a slightly different situation. We don't see that many people doing that, so we haven't covered it here, but we can do if you want, just ask us. You want to make sure that they've got enrichment, because chickens will find things to do, and if that is pecking other chickens or pecking a cabbage, for example, then you know exactly which thing you're wanting them to do. So environmental enrichment could be bales in their paddocks. So some of them have a high place and some of them have a low place. They like different, some people will have a chicken swing. That's what this guy has inside his run here. He's got a chicken swing for some of them to sit on. They like different things to peck at, different things to look at. food treats, vegetables, that kind of thing. There's all sorts of things that they enjoy doing. Scattering a bit of food in a nice non-contaminated grassy area means that they'll properly scratch around and go foraging themselves. All of these things are good for their health and essentially their mental health, because you know, it's animals, if they're not kept busy and they are that sort of flock animal, they can sometimes just start creating their own problems and getting a bit stressed if they don't have enough to do. If you're looking at more of a garden situation, or having them around the yard, if you've got some Airbnb for tourists and things, do think about the level of chicken poop that's going to be everywhere. These guys pooped all over my, as you would expect, all over my patio table every day. I knew they were going to do that before we got them. We've had them for years, obviously. So I was quite, you know, that's fine. We just pressure wash it off and give it a wee disinfect whenever we needed to use it. But if you're not actually thinking about that before you get them, then to some people it can come as a bit of a shock. They really like sitting on things.
They enjoyed the enrichment, though.
They really do. This is classic enrichment. It's just here's some of my furniture that I would like to use, but you're going to use it instead. So yeah, and you can see there we were going through, as I say, I usually get a whole bunch of different ones to find out how different things do. She was the sweetest chicken, and she was brilliant to have for nieces and nephews and things, because he was definitely one of the pettiest chickens. He was also, our plumage was rubbish in rain. Really, I'm not a massive fan of these guys. I like them as personalities, but anything sort of bluebell or blue whatever, this particular cross, they're all hybrid layers, apart from this, who is a pure breed cream leg bar. But yeah, these black rocks were great in the rain. The water just ran off them. She used to get proper bedraggled and look a bit like a drowned rat. She just wasn't quite as hard feathers. There's too much to go through just in one night, because I could sit here and talk for 6 hours and it would be awful. There are things that we can give you and places that we can point you to that you can sit and read over a coffee break that are really going to help with regards to you not having to write down every single thing that I say tonight. All of these different sources of information, we've got technical notes on our SRUC website. You are going to have to think about what you're going to do if some of your chickens get sick, or if they get old and you've decided you only want to keep them during their productive life rather than for their full lifespan. You're going to have to think about how you're going to get rid of them. You're going to have to think about whether or not you're going to cull them yourself, and you're going to then have to think about how you're going to get, you know, sufficiently experienced in order to do that. And also you're going to want to know what the permissible methods are. We have technical notes. The Humane Slaughter Association have a lot of good information on their website. The Scottish Government have the guidance booklet for the welfare of laying hens. If you keep laying hens, this is well worth looking at. It's all of the legal obligations you have for their welfare. It's going to tell you how many chickens you can have in runs, how much space to give them, how many nest boxes per hen you need to have. It's going to tell you all of those numbers that otherwise you would spend the next half an hour straining to write down. So we can give you the link for that, and you can also Google it, Scottish Government website, guidance for the welfare of laying hens and pullets, and you'll find a copy there. We also have a supplement to that. So in areas where our chicken experts felt that there could be a little bit more detail or some handy hints or tips in this document, our website has a supplement where you can get a little bit more information, which might make it a bit easier if you're fairly small scale. If you're retrofitting your existing buildings, if you've got a shed and you think, do you know what, I could put some chickens in there, you want to think about how many nesting boxes you want to put in it. The requirement is 1 per 7 birds in the guidance document. Ideally, if you've got the space, 1 per 4 is better. You want it sited in a dark part of the house, not right beside the shed window. You want it perhaps accessible from the outside, if you want that to make your life easier. and around about a foot square, a foot cubed, if you like. You are going to also want some material in the bottom of that. It might be some straw, it might be some hay, it might be some, we just used a bit of the bedding. We used to use hemp bedding. Just a deeper layer of that works. Some people will just put some easily cleanable and disinfectable soft rubber matting in there, maybe with a little bit of substrate over the top of it. Some people have a system where the eggs roll out of the nest box to a little slot on the outside and land somewhere soft. So you can retrofit a shed. Do think about how cleanable that shed is, and also, you know, how much space you have for all the things that you would need. Hens like to perch, definitely. They're really hardwired to do that, especially when they're going to sleep. So you are going to want some perches in there. We've got some tips in our technical notes about what types of perches work best, because you will see lots of different types. Ideally around about sort of 2 inches square bar, but with rounded edges, because you don't want their little feet getting rubbed away in the middle. And you want at least 6 inches space per bird. You don't want massive, because if you have a huge cavernous shed and it's the middle of winter and you've got 4 chickens in it, they're going to be very cold chickens. You do want enough chickens to fill your space so that they're all nice and warm, but at the same time, you definitely don't want them overcrowded. In terms of perch height, you really want the first perch from the ground to be at least 18 to 24 inches from the floor, so that nobody can just sit underneath and peck away at somebody's toes to annoy them. And then at least 12 inches from the other perches. It just stops people bullying. With your lighting, if you want year-round eggs, you're going to have to think about artificial lighting to make a constant day length of 14 to 16 hours. It works well for some people, it doesn't work well for others. If you've got pets, you probably aren't going to want to run an automatic lighting system with all of the running power out to your chicken house and so on that entails. If you are thinking about commercial production, selling eggs year round, then you might want to think about setting in a system, how much that would cost you, how much trouble it's going to be, so on and so forth. You can give them too much light. Too much is bad, because it does result in an increase in bullying and pecking and things, which instantly causes problems with your egg production as well, because your poor chickens are stressed. With regards to diet, there's different rations depending on whether you're growing chicks onto little poults, or if you're going from poults, which is kind of your medium stage, onto adult layers. There are chick rations, there are grower/poult rations, and then right at the end, as they're coming into lay, there's layers rations. They're not really interchangeable. Grower rations have more protein because they're growing, they need to make good muscle and bone. Layers rations have a lot of calcium, which is bad for younger chickens. It's too much calcium, but layers do need a lot of calcium to produce eggshells. You can get them out of pellets, you can get them as crumble, and you can get them as mash. If you're thinking about ducks, that is something really to think about, separate rations for ducks, and you may find that some ducks do better on pellets than on crumble, just depending. There's also supplementary feeding as well. Grit, it's not really a foodstuff, but for laying chickens, and indeed any birds, it's a good idea to have grit, because they don't have teeth. They can't mash up their food with teeth. What they do is they swallow the grit, and it all gets mashed up in their stomach by the grit particles. That comes with oyster shell for layers, because oyster shell is a really good source of calcium. You can find that any bird will get nutritional deficiencies if they're on the incorrect diet, or if treats are fed at inappropriate times. You don't want to go out there and feed all your birds treats rather than their balanced diet first thing in the morning or last thing in the evening. You want them on the nutritious food at that point. If you want to give treats, mid-afternoon is a good time. It is illegal to feed chicken scraps. Garden scraps, which are bits of vegetables that have never been into a kitchen and haven't been cut up with anything that has been in a kitchen, are fine in moderation. So if you're the type of person that tops chops and tails your carrots in the garden with a garden knife and then takes them in the kitchen and deals with the rest of the carrot, then those scraps would be okay. You don't want huge amounts of treats given to chickens because they do need that extra calcium from their food, and you don't want really long grass clippings. That just causes their digestion to grind to a halt. So for the last bit, we're going to go through what healthy chickens look like so that you're aware, and then I'll hand you over to Jeanette and she'll talk a little bit about eggs. Chickens have a very different anatomy to mammals, so that can really confuse people, because if you are 100% happy that you know what a sick cow, a sick sheep, or a sick dog or cat looks like, chickens tend to do something a bit different. Their combs should be fairly red, maybe not as red as that one, but that's, you know, red comb is normal. A pale big comb in layers is not really that normal. It could mean that they're anemic. If you buy point of lay pullets and they're not started laying yet, the bottom left corner shows you a tiny little pale comb, which is normal. They don't tend to get big and they shouldn't really be that bright until they've started laying. And if your previously healthy looking chicken starts to get a purpley blue comb, that's not good news, I'm afraid. That means it's very sick chicken. Normal, you want to look at nice bright eyes. You don't want any discharge, any tears. You don't want a snotty nose. You don't want smelly breath. For those of you that aren't aware, chickens will fill a crop, which is a little pouch right at the base of their neck. So if you suddenly find that your chicken has developed a massive growth like pouch at the bottom of its neck after its morning meal or after its evening meal, don't panic. It's a bit like hamster pouches, which, you know, people still do sometimes take to the vets to ask why their hamster have swollen up. If you're not available, if you're not 100% aware of where all the pouches are in different species, chickens, they do have them at the base of their neck. You don't want any croaking or crackling when they're breathing, which can sound like constant little sort of croaky chicken noises. If that's with every single breath, then that's not a normal chicken noise. Their back end should be clean. You shouldn't see it all sticky and horrible. They should have good feathers, unless you've just bought them as rescue commercials. They'll probably be a bit bald then, but most of the time they should have nice smooth feathers. And if you are buying them, or if you're getting them for free from your friends or whatever, it's a good idea to pick them up if you can and check their back end and under their wings. Pet chickens change hands sometimes. When people get down to their last one or two, you just want to make sure you're not buying in a couple of chickens or bringing in a couple of chickens that are going to bring lice to all your others. Feet should be smooth. Any sign of sort of rough, horrible scaly legs, then beware. They're usually curious, they're alert, they're very active, they're sometimes very vocal. If they're sitting all hunched up and it's not literally nighttime or just coming into nighttime, that's wrong. That's a cross section of their bodies across the breastbone. So you can see what I mean when I say if you went to Tesco, then this breast muscle would be plump and this breast muscle would be plump. The meat chickens in Tesco are grotesque. Laying chickens will not have that big sort of bubbly plump breast. They will definitely have a pointed shape to their front. Normal poo, there's a really wide range. If you haven't seen it before, they can sometimes vary quite a bit and still be normal. That's normal chicken poops, various normal chicken poops. The white bit is the chicken equivalent of pee. The rest of it is obviously chicken equivalent of poo. It all comes out of the same hole in chickens. It can be a bit sticky, it can be a bit firm. That's all fine. That's what we call a cecal poo. About 1 in 10 chicken poops is going to be like that. That's okay. It's sticky, yellow, frothy, horrible, really not nice to look at. But don't panic if you see that, because if they're doing normal poops as well, that's just normal digestion. This is a wee bit of intestinal lining. If you only see 1 or 2 poos like that, and not everybody's got horrible poos, it's just the occasional one, and it's kind of an orangey pink rather than a bright red blood. that's fairly normal as well. It can give people a fright, that. If they go broody, they can do the world's most massive poo because they sit in the nest box for ages and store it all up, and then they go outside and just let rip. So don't worry about that. That doesn't necessarily mean, if you've got a broody chicken, it doesn't necessarily mean that you've got a chicken with diarrhea. Watery poos can sometimes just be something you see in summer. If they really go for it, drinking water to try and cool down, sometimes they'll go like this. It might mean that they're not eating enough solid feed, and sometimes it can mean that they're ill. So it's very much something that you want to ask yourself what the situation is. Is it a heat wave right now? Is it that they've stopped managing to access food because the feeder lid has fallen over and stopped them getting at the food? Or, you know, is there a possibility that something's really wrong? If you see worms, those are likely a particular type of worm called Ascaridia. Please be aware that other, more serious worms can be totally invisible. Just because they're big doesn't necessarily mean that they're the ones that are the only ones that cause trouble. Sometimes you can't see worms at all. And if you have young chickens, if you are growing chickens rather than buying point of lay pullets, you can see real blood in the poo, which is coccidiosis. That is something that you do want to speak to your vet about as soon as you possibly can, like same day, because it's a gut parasite that gets bad very fast. If you've only got the pea portion, the white pea portion of the poo there and nothing else, I'm afraid that's not good news. That's probably a sick chicken. And if it goes a really alarming green or yellow colour, then that also could be a sign that something's wrong with somebody there.
Now, Caroline, before you move on to legs, we've got a few questions come through. So
Okay.
one that's linked directly to all your photos. Do you need to regularly worm chickens?
It's quite a good idea, yes. The situation is different for different areas. Now, in the ideal world, I would say it would be a great thing if you could poo sample your chickens and find out if they need wormed. If you don't poo sample your chickens, they go to the lab for worm egg counts, and you'll get the answer back, yes, they're fine, or no, they do need wormed. Then it is a good idea to worm them, especially if you're going to be keeping them on the same ground, because the problem is your ground can get riddled with worms. So if you were using a chicken tractor and having completely fresh ground every few days or every week or whatever, you were moving the run around, you're much less likely to need a wormer than if you have your chickens set stocked on an enclosed piece of ground where you're constantly going to have chickens probably for years. So there are different situations that might mean you might need to worm them frequently, you might need to worm them occasionally. It's always a good idea to worm them either right before, depending on where you're getting them from, or right after you've bought them, just to make sure you're not bringing anything onto your land. You might find that if you have good management that keeps your pasture contamination down, that you hardly need to worm them at all. So a worm egg count on the poo would be able to tell you which category you were in. If you can't do that, then your general management should be able to tell you whether or not you're in a category that you need to think about worming them frequently, or if you need to worm them occasionally. Some people don't really worm their chickens at all because of the situation that they're in. Some people, you know, if they're monitoring, they might find that they don't really need to give drugs. And you know, that's fine too. If it's not actually something that is that you're prone to building up on your pasture, then it is something that sometimes you can get away without really doing very often. Questions that could also be answered is, do you have a local shoot? Do you have pheasants all over your land? Are you likely to end up with your chickens getting infected with gapeworm? Wild birds carry worms. So are you free ranging them? Is there wild bird contact? Because obviously, you know, at that time, maybe there isn't a prevention order in place or a housing order in place. On a normal year, do they just free range around? What do they typically have contact with? So sometimes it's worth really sitting down and thinking to yourself, what are the risks? And then even if you're just asking your vet, perhaps via phone or perhaps during a consult with your pets or something like that, you would have all the information there to say, well, look, I do this. They are in a permanent paddock. This is how many chickens I have. This is how much space they're in. This is where I've got them and what I did. How often do you think I should worm them? There is a wormer that has a 0 egg withdrawal, because if you are producing eggs, you need to understand that some medicines mean that you cannot sell the eggs for a few days or a week or so on. The wormer that's available for chickens, there usually isn't a problem with the eggs. So even though you've wormed them, you can still eat the eggs. So that's worth keeping in mind as well.
That's great. And we've got a follow-up question, and then we've got another question about nutrition before I let you move on to legs. So
no problem.
Do pheasants increase the risk of worms?
Sometimes, some worms, yes, they can do. Pheasants are quite often treated, so it's really going to depend on the shoot. I wouldn't have a blanket sort of all pheasants are bad policy. You know, I'm certainly not pointing the finger, because some places, depending on when they get them and how they treat them afterwards, there perhaps isn't necessarily going to be a hugely increased risk of worms. On the other hand, sometimes there is. Sometimes there will be an increase. But you've got to remember as well, literally blackbirds and things can carry similar types of worms to pheasants. So if you are somebody who has a lot of natural wildlife, that's great from one point of view. But also it can increase the risk to your chickens. Rooks, crows, they can carry parasites, all sorts really.
Great. And now we're just moving back the way to question about grit. And this is particularly when we're talking about maybe housing hens that are used to free ranging. Oyster shell is not grit as soluble. Grit is not soluble. So do you want to maybe just expand a wee bit on that?
I'm sorry, I think I maybe didn't understand the purpose of the question. Not soluble.
Well, I think they were just wondering if you need something else as well as oyster shells for the hens. For the grit function for the hens, or would just a bag of oyster shell cover them for everything?
Oh, I see. Right. Sorry, that's just my hard of comprehension. It's going to depend on where your chickens are. So, for example, if you have them on a big range and they are free ranging, and it's fairly sort of dry soil, you'll find that they pick up grit. So some people will get away just with oyster shell, no problem at all. If there's a plentiful supply of gritty in the soil already. If you've got them in a run and, for example, you're clearing out substrate, or you know it's a hard run with substrate on top or whatever, then in terms of grit, you probably will want to get either mixed grit or oyster shell and grit, because the natural supply in the environment isn't going to be nearly as much.
Great. Well, that's all the questions answered for now. So thank you very much to all the people who put in questions, and to you, Caroline, for answering them. And I'll let you now talk about legs.
That's fine. It's just some pictures again of you know the type of scaly legs that you don't want to buy in chickens. That's a parasite. So if you do see thick, rough, scaly legs, it's not necessarily just age or anything like that. If you're buying, you know, if you're bringing in a couple of pets that your neighbour is down to the last few chickens or something, it can be an actual problem that you could be bringing in. And if your chicken has stopped laying, or some of your chickens have stopped laying, particularly if it's just, you know, couples that you suspect, I would always ask, have they really? If you look at a chicken and think, I don't think you've laid any eggs recently, I would start, especially on the smaller scale, you know, this is really going to be more obvious for people who've got 10 and they're pretty sure that 1 or 2 have suddenly stopped laying for some reason. I would always ask, have they really? Have they just started laying elsewhere? Does that mean that you haven't provided enough nest boxes if you've built a new sort of retrofitted an old shed? Have they just found a better place to hide them? Are they broody? Is it mistaken identity? Are you sort of looking at one chicken and thinking, I don't think you've laid for a while, but actually they have, and it's just that you are just having slightly fewer eggs right across the group. Old age, that'll certainly do it, and some, especially in the higher laying hybrids. Sometimes you get chickens that start egg eating and destroying other chickens' eggs, which can be a problem. That's something you'll see discussed on forums. Or theft. We had a stoat that used to, for a while, come up the garden and roll an egg all the way back down and take it back to its little hole. If they're molting, all you experienced chicken keepers will know they're not necessarily going to be laying very much at all while they're molting. It usually starts at the net. You start to see them a bit scraggy, generally during the second autumn, but it certainly can happen during their first autumn. Or if the light has started to go because we're coming into winter. Because stopping laying can be a sign of a disease, an early warning sign of a disease, especially if it happens right across your group. So that's why we're bothered about, besides the economics of it, that's why we're bothered about stopping laying. It can be a sign that something's going wrong, but do have a little think about it if you think that it's just one or two of them. That's Big Red. She's top chicken. She looks lovely, glossy and healthy. That's Big Red, who goes broody every single summer. And then she goes and she hides underneath the pine tree at the bottom of the garden and she hoards all of her eggs. So that's an example where you think, oh gosh, is Big Red sick? She hasn't laid for a while. Yes, she has. So just an example there. If it is none of those, or if it is more than one, be aware that there can be a problem. Some of them, if they do get a stress or a minor illness, or they've been bullied or something like that, they can stop just temporarily, just to recover. So it might not be the sign of something super serious. But if this chicken had stopped laying and she looked like this, she's a bit hunched, she's got a pale comb, even though she should have a nice bright red one because she's a layer, I would be suspicious of her. If she stopped laying, there's something wrong with her. Other eggy abnormalities, and then we'll go and Jeanette will tell you about good eggs. You sometimes get them smaller and paler. That can happen when it's just too hot, so don't panic if it's the summer. And do be aware that the so-called soft-shelled eggs that you see discussed on forums actually can be hard. They're just really thin. So if you're looking at something and thinking, is this a soft-shelled egg? It actually feels quite hard. It can sometimes refer to an egg that actually is just very thin-shelled and brittle. These are discussed from an egg quality point of view if you're selling them. And they're also discussed from a disease point of view because sometimes soft-shelled eggs are a sign of something wrong. You can sometimes get rough ones, uneven shells, wonky, or anything like that, but they're actually normal. That might mean that there's a bit of inflammation in the egg duct itself, which could be a sign that something's going a little bit wrong. But if you are, for example, right under where they fly the fighter jets to practice from the RAF or some other source of sudden and severe stress, that actually can sometimes happen if the chickens have just had a horrible fright one day, or if a predator's been in, something that's really disturbed them, or if for some reason their diet was interrupted or the water was interrupted, that kind of thing. So you could see if that continues, or maybe it just gets completely better within a couple of days, in which case there might not have been anything particularly sort of problematic going on there. If you do have soft-shelled eggs, you could have a lack of grit to muss up the diet, or you could have a lack of oyster cell or calcium in the diet as well. It could be the wrong ration. Maybe you're feeding them too many treats. Sometimes happens if they're lacking in daylight, or sometimes, as we say, happens when they're ill. If it is going on for a while, if it's going on for a few days, sort of more towards a week, or if there's a lot of chickens affected rather than just one or maybe two, I would have a chat with a vet, just because some diseases can cause that. And if they're brand new to laying, they can lay some really weird eggs for a couple of weeks. They're just practicing. Fairy eggs, if you ever see them referred to, they are eggs that don't have a yolk. Sometimes youngsters will do that too. Double yolkers are fine. They're normal. It's sometimes genetic. Sometimes one chicken will be predisposed to that. If you see blood spots on the eggs, I would be looking for mites. If you see, very rarely, but if you do see a worm in the egg, then that's obviously bad news. If your eggs are starting to taste strange, it's not always something that means their chickens is sick. Somebody once phoned me to ask for a visit because they had horrible tasting eggs suddenly at their farm gate end, and they creosoted the shed that they stored the eggs in before they put them out in the farm gate end, and it turned out that actually that was what it was. They were getting tainted. Sometimes chickens, if they eat a particular plant that is strong tasting, their eggs can sometimes taste a bit weird. Just to let you know, some things that you'll see on forums come from American forums or people that are just a little bit confused about what's legal or not. Any act of veterinary surgery doesn't, it is reservation of diagnoses of disease, giving advice to treat disease, and medical or surgical treatments. If you see any of that happening on a forum, I'm afraid it's not only unreliable, it's actually illegal. So do be aware that there's a lot of stuff out there that is just plain wrong, and also sometimes could get you in a lot of trouble. With egg peritonitis, you'll hear a lot about that. Be assured, we're going to talk about all of that next week. Essentially, it means that instead of the egg forming properly and coming out of the chicken, some of the yolk material ends up floating around inside the chicken's abdomen, and it's not good. It's not a good thing when that happens. So we will go into that in detail. And behavioural problems, as we've said already, chickens can be bullied. They can peck feathers. If their diet's insufficient, if they've got too much or too little light, if they're crammed in together, if there's big changes in management. Sometimes, in some cases, people think that some lighter coloured chickens might be a bit more prone to getting bullied, or if there's a cockerel there, or more than one coming to maturity. All of these things can cause you some stress and behavioural problems, so just be aware of that. It can present as vent pecking as well. They'll peck the back ends, or sometimes they'll peck the comb. It's important to get in and intervene early if you do see chickens bleeding, because the other chickens will not leave them alone. They're really attracted to blood. So you're going to have to get in there, scoop up that chicken, get it isolated from the rest until it's all dried up. And that's what it might look like, a little bit of blood on the comb. If you do see wounds, chicken skin can tear quite easily. They can make quite a hole in each other quite quickly, so you do need to act quickly. But the good news is, if they have managed to cause another chicken to bleed, chickens do heal really well. So with your isolation, you might want to think about having in your first aid kit wound spray and anti-peck spray. We'll talk about a bit more next week about louse powder. We'll talk a bit about having a red mite treatment for the house, and possibly a tonic to put in their water. That's some of the things that I would just have as a basic first aid kit. The sort of thing that you see a problem one afternoon and you think, oh, well, I don't want to spend 2 days, getting in the stuff to actually deal with this, especially if you're not local to a good agricultural supplier. I really want to get that started right now. These are some of the things that you can really get started with. And overall, be prepared but not worried. They're great to have. I know there's been a lot of scaring going on about the avian influenza and things like that, and it is a scary situation when you have an infectious disease like that can get into your birds. But there's no such thing as bothering vets about things. There's no such thing as, especially if it's ourselves or the APHA, if you're really worried about avian influenza, that's basically what we're all here for, is to help out with advice and try and prevent problems. And it's not a case of scary agency or anything like that, scary government. It's literally you'll give them a phone and you'll find out that actually it's just so useful in terms of putting your mind to rest if you did worry that you were going to be at risk of bird flu, or if you, God forbid, thought you might have bird flu. So yeah, be prepared but not worried. There's lots of people out there to help you. And we'll head on to Jeanette and hear all about the egg production side of things.
Excellent. Well, before we do that, we've got two questions come through.
Mhm.
So, what is your opinion on the best thing for on the floor? They've tried straw, shaving, sand. What do you think is best for putting on the floor of the hen shed?
Everything's got pros and cons. I know you don't want to hear that. I really like the hemp bedding, but it is a bit more expensive sometimes, and it's not always available in some areas. It's the same sort of stuff that people use to bed some horse stalls. So I've found that the benefits of that is it's low dust, and also it is quite absorbent. It's good if you're in a wet area. So the low dust is good because it irritates their breathing, their lungs and airways less, and the absorbency is good because we're in Scotland. It is a little bit more pricey. Straw will be less absorbent, but it might be the cheapest thing locally and the most practical thing for you. Sand can be quite abrasive, so if you have pet chickens or heavy breed chickens, or if it gets clumped together because it's quite damp, you sometimes find you'll have more foot problems with sand. Some people have used paper shavings, some people have used sawdust. Not a big fan of bark chippings for runs. If you were going to go wood chip or bark chip, and that was the only two choices for a run, I would go wood chip, because the bark chip has a tendency to go a bit more moldy, and again, that can sometimes cause respiratory infections in chickens. It can cause breathing infections in chickens. So yeah, there are always going to be pros and cons depending on how big an area you're talking, how often you're thinking about really going through and replacing the whole lot rather than just sort of sifting it out. And what types of chickens you have. You know, is it a pet situation? Is it a commercial situation? These are all considerations. So yeah, there's no one thing that stands out as being the gold standard in everything from economics to usability to absorbency, everything. So yeah.
Great. We'll move on to the next question. Well, we've got two questions actually that are similar, and it's on nutrition. So the first question is, are layer pellets and poultry grain okay for hybrid layers?
Layer pellets are great. Yeah, poultry grain has its uses. So for example, sometimes if it's cold, people will give them grain as a treat mid-afternoon because the extra carbs and everything, it just gives them that wee bit of extra heat. I wouldn't go just straight grain because that's not going to give them enough calcium. It's always, you know, the maize, kibbled maize or barley or whatever that's used just as poultry grain is usually used as a complementary feed, not a complete feed. So your layers pellets are designed to be a complete diet. That's the reason that sometimes people don't feed oyster grit, is that technically, most of the time in most situations, you'll find that layers rations will give them sufficient calcium. Sometimes if they're out free range foraging and things and eating bugs and eating grass and, you know, if your my chicken's eating all the flowers but none of the weeds, you'll find that they don't eat sufficient layered pellets, and you might want to supplement them with oyster shell as well to make absolutely certain that they do take in enough calcium, because that's going to be one of the main deficiencies that you're worried about. But yeah, there's a place for both. You can just go straight layers pellets, but grain is something that they will love. They'll enjoy scratching around for it because you can just scatter it on a nice clean bit of ground. And it does, when it's cold and wet, give them a wee extra boost of energy as well when they might need it.
Great. So then moving on, the second question was, are layer pellets and poultry grain together in an ad hoc ad lib feeder okay for hybrid layers?
I would usually go for pellets, ad lib, and then grain as the treat. Just because they should really be packing their crops with as nutritious food as possible first thing in the morning and last thing at night. And in between, they'll probably eat a variety of things. It's just the way that they sometimes digest overnight as well. You know, they're gently digesting everything. They're absorbing the calcium and all the nutrients overnight. It's not to say that some people haven't made a homemade mixture diet where they put in, you know, their vegetables and their grain and their layers, pellets and things like that as well. Because some people can do it and have done it. But I would say that there is a much bigger scope for things to start to go wrong. If you're looking at a really high production hybrid layers, then you kind of want them on the diet that's going to give them their very best performance. If you've got scratchy little pure breeds that lay an egg sort of every few days, and they're tootling about your backyard and things, and they're mostly for breeding to sell or to store or whatever, then you can certainly get away with a diet that is less high nutrition, just because they're not putting out the same amount of nutrition. Hybrid layers are literally built to take in lots of protein and calcium and put out lots of protein and calcium in the form of an egg. If they're not doing that constantly all the time, then they won't need to take in quite so much good nutrition. They're pretty impressive performance animals, really.
And we'll just one last disease question for you, and I apologize, I'm probably going to mangle the pronunciation of this. The question was lack of eggs, ? Mycoplasmus.
Could be, yeah. So I'll talk a bit about mycoplasma, which is one of the most common sort of respiratory cough/cold type diseases that you'll see in chickens. It's one of the things that when it turns up, it can scare the pants off people because they're instantly thinking, I've got a coughing chicken, is this bird flu? So we can talk about that in depth next week. But yeah, anything that makes you sick, if you're a super high performance animal, it very well could cause your eggs to drop away and for them to produce far less eggs, because their whole body is instantly turned to, I need to make sure and get better from this thing, rather than I feel great, I'm going to perform at my very highest level.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for answering those questions. And you might one board's come in, and then I'll share my screen. So first question, so how are eggs made? And I just find this fascinating. So basically what this is what's inside your hens. And then this is the ovary. And then if we move through, you can see that this is where the yolk happens first, and then it spends about 15 minutes in this place while the yolk is being made. And then it moves, see, high quality graphics here. And then the next stage is that the yolk moves into the longest part of the oviduct, the magnum, where it'll spend about 3 hours. And that's when the white bit gets added. And this is what produces the template for the shell. And then it moves further down, and then there's more of the albumin deposited, and the shell membranes are laid down. It takes about 75 minutes here. And then the egg moves into the uterus and the shell gland, and it'll spend about 20 hours. And then this is where the thin albumin is added, and the shell and the pigment. And then it's just before the egg is laid that the waxy cuticle that we'll see on our eggs is added too. So Caroline was saying they're high performance, but I think it's actually maybe an underappreciated miracle what our hens are doing. And as it's the egg is laid through the vent, and then also we've not touched on breeding at all, but that's the same place. Then it tends to be only one oviduct that becomes functional. So now we know how eggs are produced in the hen. We're going to talk about some egg selling rules. And the things to consider are where you're selling the eggs, how many hens you have, and that will impact what registrations are required that you have. So we don't need to talk about lighting, but if you are trying to, it's something to consider if you're trying to have a sales, because you either need to educate your customers that there'll be breaks when you'll have eggs and breaks when you won't, or if you are wanting to have a year-round continuous supply, especially up in Skye, it's pitch black outside, you probably would need to think about having some kind of lighting. So now, like I said, it depends where you're selling. If you're selling at the farm gate, that's different to if you're selling at a market stall or a shop. And then if you're selling indirectly, so as a third person, then this is where like the eggs that you would buy yourself in a shop, where you're seeing all the eggs being stamped in the pack house thing, that comes in this case. So I think I possibly have the record for registering the smallest flock. I think I had a client who had like 4 or 5 hens, but they were selling through a shop, so they did need to get registered. One of the inspectors found out. So this is possibly too small to see on the slide, but anybody who's interested, we created this flow chart to help you work out where you fall in this category. Whether you're selling, if you're selling at the farm gate, you don't need to get involved in the egg stamping, but if you're selling indirectly to shops, you definitely do. And FAS can help advise you on going through the processes for getting registered, both as an egg producer and an egg packer. But I didn't want to go into get lost in the weeds of this tonight. I just wanted to be able to give you resources to highlight where you can get the support to do this if you want. So where do you get bespoke advice for your own selling situation? The FAS helpline is free, and here's the number for you to call here. And these are sort of regulations, but I think and there's the interesting story Caroline had about the taint from the creosote. Even if you're just doing eggs for your own family consumption, these are really important rules. It's important that you store your eggs correctly, and you store them in a stable temperature, and keep them away, especially if it's in a byre. You have to be thinking about keeping them away from rats, who will enjoy them equally as much as Caroline's stoat. You want to, in a small scale, this never happen. It won't be as long, but they have to be sold within 21 days, and the best before date has to be within 28 days from the day of lay. So if you are getting into that process, you do need to think about what is sort of sensible records for you to keep. And also, one of the rules is that you need to have a best before. So if you're just your own consumption and friends, again, it's just good to, some people don't know. So if you are selling, just giving people eggs as a gift, it's maybe a good idea to give them an indication, oh, they were just laid yesterday, so you can use them up to this date, kind of thing, because otherwise sometimes people ditch eggs that are perfectly fine to eat too. Now, if you are wanting to do in a bigger situation, a really good early step is the SAC Farm Management Handbook has pages on different scales of egg production. So there's the sort of like the farm scale, but there's also page 278 covers more the crofting and smallholder scale, because obviously if you're selling to a supermarket, it's a much lower price per egg that you're getting, whereas if you're selling direct to a niche market, your price per half dozen can be much higher. So this is a good place to start if you're thinking, well, I'm not just wanting to do this as a complete hobby, I am quite interested in it. This is a good place to start. But you can also, again, go back to the farm advisories helpline to get help. If you've got an SAC FAS crofter subscription, you'll get 2 hours of advice, and that can be for hens as much as it's for sheep and cows. If you are wanting to do any kind of new thing with hens, then a specialist plan might be something worth applying for. And that means that the Scottish Government gives a grant of up to £1,000 of free advice, not including the VAT, that allows an advisor to help you plan for things. So if you were thinking of investing in new housing and you weren't quite sure how to make it resilient for bird flu and meeting all new regulations, that's something else that you could do. And as I said at the start, here's myself and Caroline's email addresses, so that if you've got any questions after, you can contact us. We're delighted to hear from you, and we'll send you reminders on how to sign up for our next webinar, which is not next week, but the following week. And the last thing I wanted to leave you with is I think at times the hens are my favorite animals on the croft, and it's really just important that you just enjoy them.
Yes, so we've got one question coming in just now. I give the date of lay, but leave it to the recipient to decide by when they should eat them. Is that wrong?
I don't think it's wrong, but we can double check. But I think, strictly speaking, the if you're selling branded eggs, I think you are meant to have a best like to eat best before date. But I will double check that.
Great, and we have another thank you, which is very much appreciated. Thank you very much for that. I'm glad to hear that it's been useful. Any advice for rare breeds such as Scots Dumpy and Scots Grey? What sort of context would that be for? As in, where would those breeds do best? Or if you were going for rare breeds, are those the best for Scotland? If you do have a wee bit more context, that would be good to have. And I'll just have a wee look at the chat. And a couple of people saying they'll see us in a couple of weeks, so that's great. So if you do want to give us a shout and sort of chat through things like Scots Dumpy and Scots Greys via email, that's absolutely fine too. We've got a question. If we can cover diatomaceous earth for treating red mites, that would be useful. I've found it's quite useful, but our vet doesn't know much about hens. Yeah, we'll definitely be covering that. And it's very tailorable, the second session as well. We wanted to get the big bulk of, you know, what the basics are that people should be thinking about early on, or if they're expanding, or if they're just about to get chickens. But certainly the second session, if you want to give us a shout, via email, or you know, even if you want to pop a chat comment in next time, we're happy to cover a few more different things, because we just had a big thumping great plan for this week, and we can definitely make it a bit more interactive next week as well. The little bit more detail about the Scots Dumpy and Scots Grey question is whether or not there's specific issues that come up for those breeds. We're in Scotland, and due to them being native, we'd hope to be happy in the environment. Do you want to, have you got any Scots Dumpies or Greys, Jeanette?
No, sorry, we're ISA brown all the way. Please carry on.
No problem. There's a couple of bits and pieces. Scots Greys are brilliant hardy chickens. I do know somebody who's kept them for a very long time. If you happen to see the Facebook page for the Scottish Smallholders Association, I think there's 2 or 3 different associations that call themselves Scottish, but there's one specifically that's based down by Ayr, and I think it's the Scottish Smallholders Association rather than Smallholding Scotland, which is a different one. But one of the organisers for that was for years a very prolific keeper of Scots Greys. She's called Liza, and I know that she's a huge fan of the breed. He always said that although they're super hardy and, you know, great chickens to have, they're obviously going to lay a lot less than your hybrid layers, because they are pure breed chickens, so they don't pour with eggs the same way, and also they're quite independent and quite feisty. So if you want something really super docile that's definitely going to stay where it's put and isn't going to, you know, go up trees or anything like that, or try and escape to the neighbours, then they might not be the ones for you, just personality wise. If you're quite happy to have quite a feisty free ranging chicken, but not with necessarily daily eggs, then they are a great wee breed. With the Dumpies, there's some issues that are specific to them. They have really short legs, and the way that they have ended up with short legs is specifically because it's a genetic sort of trait that they have that isn't constant. So I would look at it online if you're ever thinking about having Scots Dumpies and then you're thinking about breeding them, because you can go wrong pretty quickly. They do carry a gene that can be lethal for some of the chicks if you don't breed them the right way. So if that is something that you're considering, look into that. If you're just keeping them for laying hens, then some of the characteristics of those that make them attractive to people is they're quite docile, and they don't tend to dig up your garden as badly because they've only got wee short legs. So, you know, if you do have them free ranging around and you kind of want, I'm not saying they're not going to dig up your garden at all, because they don't guarantee that with chickens, but Scots Dumpy keepers tell me that they are less likely in their opinion, to be digging as much as some other breeds. So that's one of the things that used to make them very attractive. So hopefully that'll help. Do have a look for that Facebook page, and if you do see Liza at the Scottish Smallholders Association, he'd be a really good person to talk to about having kept birds of those breeds for many, many years. And I would have a wee look online for anybody local that supplies them as well, and they'll chat you through the pros and cons. Anybody decent is going to be able to tell you what they love about their breed and also what might be the drawbacks. A wee comment, could we do something similar for duck keeping and breeding, and details on incubating eggs and raising pullets to point of lay sale would be great. So that's good to know for next time. And our query about Scots Dumpies and Greys says they will be looking at breeding, so they will look into that. So that's good to know. Yeah, the Greys themselves, they're fine. It's really the Dumpies with their wee short legs that you do need to look at, so that you don't end up in catastrophe. And you might be interested to know that if you breed them a certain way, they don't end up dumpy. So you get things that are long legs, you get things that are dumpies, and sometimes you do get things that go unfortunately wrong. So well worth looking at in. Oh, somebody else seconding the duck request. That's really good to know. Somebody wants to know, can you send photos of hens before the next session? You absolutely can. Feel free to send us pictures for whatever reason. And either if you've got a cute chicken and you want us to share them, we will do that. If you've got a chicken problem and you'd like me to look at it, that's absolutely fine too.
That's fantastic. Well, I'd like to thank you all very much for participating so much. And afraid one last thing, because it's Scottish Government funded, there will be evaluation forms coming out. And if you can make it, I know you're all busy, but if you can make a time to fill them in and get them sent off, it does make it much easier for us to run other events like the duck one that has been requested. So I appreciate your help in advance for that. Well, only leaves me to say thank you all very, very much for coming. And Caroline, thank you so much for all your expertise that you've shared tonight as well. So appreciate it all. And if you haven't already signed up for the second webinar, please do. And we'll look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.